Welcome to the Religious Studies Project, hosted by Christopher Cotter and myself, David Robertson. This podcast is produced in association with the British Association for the Study of Religions, and you can visit our website at www.religiousstudiesproject.com.
Rudolf Otto is one of the seminal figures in the history of religious studies. Regardless of whether we have agreed or disagreed with his work, there are a few scholars today who aren't in some way reacting to these ideas. So it is my great pleasure to introduce Robert Orsi from Northwestern University, author of Between Heaven and Earth, The Religious Worlds People Make and the Scholars Who Study Them, and also more recently, the Cambridge Companion to the Study of Religion.
Right.
So, Professor Orsi, welcome to the Religious Studies Project.
Thank you. It's good to be here, actually, Jonathan.
That's great. I guess the most basic question that we can begin with is, who is Rudolf Otto? Or who was, rather?
Rudolf Otto was a late 19th, early 20th century German theologian, Lutheran theologian, who was also a theorist of religion, who became interested, as many in that generation, actually, of Lutheran theologians did, who became interested in the academic study of religion from a kind of comparative point of view. He's best known, in fact, this is why he's known. He's best known for a book he wrote in 1917 called, in English, The Problem of the Holy. In German, it was called, not the problem of the holy,
the idea of the holy.
Idea
I was going to say,
holy.
I wonder, is that the American?
The problem of the holy is the title of my chapter on Otto in the Cambridge Companion to Religious Studies. The idea of the holy was the English translation, but the German title was the holy. And I think that already signals the problem of Otto, because he wasn't really talking about an idea, and he wasn't talking about a subjective experience. And this is really what has led, I think, to Otto's what makes Otto a controversial at best, irrelevant in many ways at worst, a figure in the study of religion. And that is this idea that what he's proposing is an objective encounter, a human encounter with an objective reality outside that human. And that's what he's talking about. He's not talking about an idea of that reality.
So could you elaborate on that? Let's set the field clear at this point. If we're not talking about an idea, what is Otto talking about?
Well, the first thing to keep in mind is that Otto is very much working within a Kantian framework, all right? So it's essential to understand that he's working very much on trying to understand how we can talk about religion within the limits of reason, to use a Kantian phrase. So how do you, given the restrictions that Kant imposed upon human knowing, Otto's question was, well, then how can we know anything about our gods, or how do we know anything about the supernatural? And he said basically that there is this one human phenomenon, this one human capacity that actually is not limited by the categories of space and time, that can apprehend the real as the real presents itself to the mind. It's just in this case of the holy or the numinous.
So, yes.
Now, what is the holy or the numinous?
Yes.
I think it's interesting that Otto had to generate a new terminology, actually, for most of what. So he called it the numinous, the mysterium tremendum, and he says that its human origins are in feelings of dread about the fear of ghosts and the fear of the dark and the forest. That's sort of the human dimension of it. But he really wants to say that this is not a human. This is not about experiencing a ghost outside of, this is not about seeing a ghost. Rather, the mysterium tremendum is an experience of the awfulness, the realness of the supernatural.
So that's interesting, because you mentioned earlier that Otto was a theologian, so many listeners will be instantly thinking, he's talking about God, but the example you use there is ghosts, and it's not so much about the content of the experience so much as the experience itself,
right,
that is important.
Right, and he says this is a shared human experience, although he's not clear that all humans it's a universal human capacity. Whether or not all humans have it or exercise it is another story. And he had this idea, which again comes from Kant, of schematization. So basically what he said was people have this experience of this numinous, this ganz andere, the totally other, this reality outside of oneself that's really real. And then different cultures explain it in different ways, and that's the process of schematization, as he calls it. So some might call it Krishna, or name it the demonic, or whatever. And this is one of the reasons why Otto fell out of favor. As far as Otto was concerned, the finest expression of the reality of the numinous was the Protestant Christian expression.
Just out of curiosity, when you say he falls out of favor, who is he falling out of favor in his particular context?
Well, actually, that's a great question, because in some ways Otto was never in favor. The book was a tremendous popular success. Actually, it was something of a bestseller. Actually, the Das Heilige, or the idea of the holy in English. But immediately scholars had problems with it. So it's almost as if Otto came along either too early or too late for his time, but the Christians found it too open to other religions, too attentive to human experiences outside of the Christian domain. Christians found it too vague, insufficiently Christological, and then people in other religions found it too Christian. So it had a popular appeal, but it did not appeal to scholars.
So he kind of sits in this very awkward position at the end of theology dominating the study of religion and the beginning of what became the comparative study of religion.
Yeah, I think that's actually a really good way of putting it. I mean, he really is a kind of transitional figure. And then he kind of disappears. He doesn't quite, well, as we were talking earlier before, he doesn't quite disappear as much as he becomes a sort of whipping boy for a certain way of talking about religion. And what that way of talking about religion is a way of talking about religion that is not situated within the social and the cultural. I mean, Otto seemed to be, and he was, looking towards a religious experience that could not be accounted for in social, cultural terms. And, once the study of religion took off as a modern discipline, that became the dominant framework for the study of religion, was the sociological and the anthropological and the psychological. But that was not what Otto was talking about.
There's a certain connection between Otto and romantic notions that we can't put rational explanations into, even though he essentially gives a typology of religious experiences to a certain extent.
Right, it is. He's a romantic. I mean, I locate him in the sort of romantic reaction to Kant. I would see. I mean, he himself was a disciple, an intense reader of Schleiermacher, and so behind him is the German theologian, the early 19th century theologian Schleiermacher, who emphasized feeling as the feeling of utter dependence as the key to religion. Otto dissented from that because he really wanted to see this as not a human. The experience of the holy was not equivalent to fear. It wasn't equivalent to dependence. It wasn't equivalent to need. It was its own distinct human experience.
Which, of course, these days has become a problem for a lot of people, these ideas of generis categories that can't be explained with other methodologies. And this is something that you kind of briefly mentioned before, in the sense that Otto's a bit of a straw man for people. There's a lot of literature out there. For instance, I was reading Gordon Lynch's book, who happens to be presenting here, where we're actually talking at the Religion and Society conference right now, and Gordon Lynch picks on Otto's notion from his Durkheimian perspective. And there's a lot of scholars who really pick on Otto, sorry. Why is it? Why do we keep going back to Otto?
Well, I think we keep going back to Otto. I mean, let me again note that this was a popular success. I mean, I think we go back to Otto because I do believe that Otto named the human experience that is a recognizable human experience. Otto famously says, it's on page 8 of the English translation, he famously says, look, if you haven't had this experience, stop reading the book because you're not going to know what I'm talking about. That was that was unfortunate because that also made the book seem almost Gnostic in its framing. If you're not part of the club of people who have had religious experience, then you can't know religion, and that's an offensive comment to scholars of religion. But yeah, I mean, the problem with Otto is that he appears to say, and I mean, I think he is saying, I mean, once the social became the dominant register for explaining religion, Otto seemed again irrelevant. I mean, so the contrast between Durkheim and Otto is perfect, because for Durkheim, religion was all about society, all about the group. Whereas for Otto, although I think it's a misreading of Otto to see the experience of the holy as an individual experience, it wasn't an individual experience. His example of the sort of what he said was the best example of how the holy operated or worked was Jesus and his apostles. That it was a communal experience of the holy.
I want to go back to that. You mentioned that famous line in the book where it's like, if you have not had an experience of this kind, stop reading it. I have no interest in you, and you'll gain nothing from it, because it taps into a very nascent aspect of religious studies where scholars are being divided over whether we can study religion if we ourselves don't have religious sentiments. Is that the main thing that Otto, by accident in effect, picks out this trend, this very important point for religious studies? Can we study religion without religious experiences?
Yeah, I mean, I think the short answer to that is yes, we can, and that it's essential to hold on to that. And I think without that becomes, I mean, I really would say no, you do not have to have religious experiences. On the other hand, I mean, I do think you have to have some empathy or openness to the reality of what other people are telling you that they have experienced. And you have to at least, I mean, I think what drove me back to Otto was my sense that to do empirical justice, to be a true empiricist of the religious, I had to think about this experience that people were having. Some spaces, some times, some figures were marked as another colleague of mine in the United States, Ann Taves, who is working on this from a cognitive perspective, she calls it the special. Certain figures are marked with a powerful specialness. And I think that needs to be addressed as scholars of religion empirically.
In that respect, because the idea of tapping into these religious feelings, there's a strong association between Otto and the phenomenological movement. I was wondering if you could comment on that, because in my own personal readings, originally I thought that Otto doesn't belong with phenomenology. He's a completely different sphere, but there's certain suggestions that maybe that initial opinion was wrong.
Tell me more what you mean by the phenomenological tradition. Who do you have in mind?
Mainly Husserl onwards.
Well, I mean, I think part of what gives Otto, what perhaps establishes the connection to the phenomenological field, is the experiential dimension of Otto. His emphasis that this is a particular kind of experience, out of which then there are consequences. Things happen as a result of this experience, and we have to understand this experience. We have to understand this experience, which is pre-linguistic or non-linguistic. It's embodied, and so we're challenged as people who use all these tools to think about this phenomenon that is encountered this way.
In that respect, as people are supposed to put these experiences into linguistic terms, how are we then supposed to go about that? I mean, did Otto ever provide any tools by which you could start to talk about this construction?
Yeah, Otto actually, there's a poetics to the book. Otto actually, to Otto's vision of the holy. He believed that a completely straightforward, rational description of this thing, of this experience, would not suffice. And he says in his book that he tries to evoke the experience. He tries to not induce the experience, but he tries to evoke it. He tries to give readers a kind of glimpse of this experience. And I think that's actually a worthy goal for scholars of religion. We go out there and we enter worlds in which people have these experiences, and I think it's part of our responsibility to give people a sense, to give our readers a sense of what it is that these experiences are like. I mean, snake handling, for example, to take an American Pentecostal idiom. So, snake handling is completely weird, but for them, that's an experience of the holy. I mean, that's for them the experience of the holy, right? To just explain that in terms of poverty or mining communities or pathologies of various sort, I think does an empirical injustice to the experience. They're having an experience of the holy, and we have to give some glimmer of what they are experiencing if we can get a glimpse of it ourselves.
Okay, it's interesting you use words like evoke rather than induce, so it does kind of go back to his comment that if you haven't had an experience of this kind, then you're a little bit scuppered in that respect. I mean...
Yes, excuse me, to interrupt you very briefly, that's also, William James, who I would put in this, in my essay in the Cambridge Companion on Otto, I call it the tradition of the Moor. And I try to locate other scholars like myself who are interested who believe that religious phenomenon are not sufficiently accounted for by sociological, linguistic, anthropological, political explanations. And so when James tried to give a sense of what religious experience was, he does it by biography, which Otto also did. So you can do it by biography, you can evoke experience, but you have to, in some way, you have to have a poetics.
Yeah. You've just mentioned James. I am aware of the work of James, but I'm not necessarily aware of the connection between James and Otto. Does Otto draw on the work of James? I mean, to what extent does he appropriate James's philosophies?
I'm trying to remember now. I don't think Otto actually cites James anywhere, but because again, he's not interested in a psychology of religion. He's interested in this experience of this Ganzandra, this experience of the Moor. I evoke James because James was also interested in this experience of the Moor.
Okay, so working on this concept of the Moor, how adequate do you think this concept is? I mean, I'm not necessarily thinking of like the Durkheimian responses here in which Otto becomes a strawman argument. I'm thinking more in terms of Ninian Smart's own appraisal of Otto's work and saying that it never went far enough. That, for instance, particularly with like Buddhist experiences, it didn't really understand Buddhist experiences. I mean, how fair a critique do you think that is of Otto's?
That this is not a universal...
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've gotten past, we being scholars of religion, and I think we've probably given up on the notion of a universal. On the other hand, cognitive scientists are now coming back to this notion, and I think they would say that Otto probably was onto something. That there is he himself said that there is a little bit of the anxiety we feel in the forest, or what did he call it? The experience of creeping flesh was his word for it. This idea that we sometimes get a chill when we think we're having an experience of something that's really out of the ordinary. I think that's a universal experience, actually.
Could you actually comment more on that relation of Otto kind of reappearing, as it were, in the mode of cognitive sciences? Because my experience of cognitive science of religion has been very much so of something that is moving towards explaining away religion. That we're going to explain religion in terms of psychological processes and
brain, the workings of the brain.
And the workings of the brain and evolutionary kinks that have yet to be lost.
Otto does say at one point, actually, that it's possible that the experience of creeping flesh may have had an evolutionary purpose. It is worth pointing out that he is not identifying the experience of the creeping flesh or the kind of the uncanny with the Ganzandra, the Numinous. That's a separate human experience. But he did say that it had an evolutionary purpose. I guess what I'm thinking of is this the way in which cognitive scientists are interested in how certain phenomena are marked out as separate. Like, why is it that a mother bonds to a child, or a child, actually the other way around? How is it that a child will bond to a mother almost instantly after birth. So, they're trying to figure out these sort of workings of the brain and how the brain is connected to the world. And I think Otto identified an experience that cognitive scientists have to pay attention to.
So going on there, because now that you've spoken about the cognitive science, which is a very recent development, in your opinion, what is Otto's value for scholars of religion today? Because, he's been set up as the straw man. Why should we keep paying attention to Otto? Why do people, a lot of students will be listening to this, and some of them may not have even heard Otto because they'll have come through the cognitive science. Why should they be paying attention to him now?
I think the reason is because those of us who have studied religion have glimpsed in our work and I hear I'm speaking about a completely human reality. Now, let me be clear about what I'm saying, because the potential for misunderstanding is huge. I'm not saying that we should forego social, cultural, psychological analyses. I'm not saying that the linguistic, that the universes within people come to be and in which they live, the worlds of the discursive worlds and the political worlds and so forth in which people come to be are irrelevant. I think experience always arises within particular contexts. Having said that, it just seems to me that, say, a Pentecostal's experience of Jesus or the Holy Ghost, you can talk about that in terms of the Pentecostals' poverty or now the Pentecostals' aspirations for prosperity. You can talk about it with reference to the social, but that doesn't capture, I think, fully the reality of the Holy Ghost and the efficacy and power of the Holy Ghost in a Pentecostal's life. So I like to use the example of a Pentecostal social worker. A Pentecostal social worker is motivated by a deep sense of Jesus' reality. And as scholars of religion, I think we must think about what that reality means in a life. Just the way, what does that reality mean? What does it mean to live with that reality in one's life? That's what I'm talking about. And I think Otto helps us begin to think about. He calls our attention back to the really real, this reality that we experience as having a reality that's apart from us, to which we must respond.
Okay, that's brilliant. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Well, you're Otto.
You've been listening to Jonathan Tuckett talking to Robert Orsi about the subject of Rudolf Otto and his idea of the Numinous. We're bringing our series on the sacred to a close next week with an interview that Chris recorded with Brian Victoria on the subject of Zen Buddhist terrorism. So that's sure to be an interesting and possibly controversial episode. We'll be posting a response to this interview from Chris Duncan on Wednesday. And as always, our Opportunities Digest will go out on Friday. And don't forget that it's now available as a PDF as well for you to email around your colleagues or to print out and pin up in your department. And we're getting a lot of feedback that people are finding that very useful, which is good news. The week after that, we'll be going on to one of our semi-regular compilation episodes, and this time it's on the subject of what is the public benefit of the academic study of religion. And anyone who was at the BASR conference this year will know that that was one of the big debates that took place there. So we're glad to have some of the scholars who took part in that debate at BASR in this forthcoming episode. And later that week, in lieu of a response, we'll be putting out our first book reviews episode, which we're producing in collaboration with Ashgate and Equinox. So we hope that you'll enjoy that. For now, however, I'm going to say, please rate us on iTunes if you get the chance. You can comment on this if you have any critiques, comments, rants, compliments on our Twitter feed, on our at Project RS, on our Facebook page, or on the comments on the website. And we understand that the comments have been down for a little time. We had a bit of a spam bot attack, but they're now open again. So please do get involved in the discussion there. But for now, all that's left to say is thanks for listening.